The hall was wrapped in polished silence, velvet chairs, and the faint echo of cameras preparing to immortalize another royal moment. Then, one sentence shattered it all. "Even the crown must answer for its privilege," Keir Starmer said, voice dipped in mock civility, the kind that cloaks contempt as reason. The crowd froze. Eyes darted toward Prince William, standing just a few feet away, his hands clasped, his posture calm, but his silence loud enough to cut through marble. For a heartbeat, the air seemed to bend, the distance between monarchy and politics collapsing into raw tension. It wasn't just an insult, it was a challenge dressed as intellect, and the entire nation, watching through screens and headlines, felt it. In that pause, every camera leaned forward, waiting to see. Would the future king stay quiet? Or would he finally speak? Transition. What came next, no one expected. The confrontation didn't unfold in a debate hall or campaign stage. It happened in a place meant for unity. The remembrance ceremony, sacred and solemn, was supposed to transcend politics. Veterans in uniform stood shoulder to shoulder, their medals catching the light like fragments of history. But Starmer's words sliced through that sanctity, transforming reverence into theater. To some, he was holding power accountable. To others, he was playing God with decorum. And for Prince William, this wasn't just another jab at the monarchy, it was an insult to legacy itself. Behind his calm expression, generations of service flickered like silent film reels. His grandmother's steadfast reign, his father's quiet devotion, the weight of continuity. This was more than a remark. It was an assault on identity. Viewers at home could feel it too. The shift, the unease, the electricity of something about to break. Comment sections lit up. "Did he really say that?" One wrote. "Watch William's face," another replied. Because what happened next would not just silence a politician, it would awaken a nation. For years, Keir Starmer built his reputation as the man who never flinched. The prosecutor who could stare down lies and dismantle arrogance with surgical precision. A man who spoke in facts, wore discipline like armor, and carried ambition like a secret weapon. But somewhere along the climb from courtroom to parliament, that armor hardened into something colder. Detachment. His conviction began to sound less like truth and more like performance. He stopped listening to win hearts. He listened to craft comebacks. In the echo chambers of London's elite, they whispered about his brilliance, his strategy, his unshakable calm. But brilliance can breed blindness. Starmer began to believe that intellect alone could command respect, that empathy was weakness, that the crown's quiet authority was an outdated myth. He measured legacy by poll numbers, not by service. He forgot that humility is often the loudest form of power. It wasn't that he hated the monarchy, he pitied it. To him, they were relics in a modern democracy, symbols to critique rather than understand. He prided himself on being the realist in a nation of sentimentalists. Yet beneath the calculated tone and half-smile, there was something else. A restlessness, a need to prove that his rise from working-class roots to leadership wasn't just luck, but destiny. Every press conference, every debate, every clipped soundbite was another brick in the monument of his self-image. The reformer, the rationalist, the man who would drag Britain into modernity. But arrogance often disguises itself as progress. And while Starmer crafted the language of change, he lost the humility that makes change possible. He no longer argued for people, he argued for applause. The lines blurred between conviction and ego, between serving and winning. The very traits that once made him formidable, his sharp logic, his unwavering certainty, had begun to turn inward, trapping him in his own self-assured reflection. So when he raised that pointed question toward Prince William, it wasn't spontaneous outrage, it was strategy. A chance to flex power in a room where tradition usually reigned. A chance to remind the world that no crown was above critique. But what he didn't understand, what his brilliance blinded him to, was that not every room needs dominance. Some require grace. And as the cameras rolled, he believed he was in control of the moment. He didn't notice how still the audience had become. He didn't sense how small his voice sounded against the weight of silence. The irony was cruel. The man who had built a career on dismantling pride had become its embodiment. His downfall wouldn't come through scandal or anger. It would come through contrast. His noise against another man's calm. His calculation against sincerity. Because sometimes the most devastating rebuttal isn't shouted. It's simply earned. Transition. And that quiet power, the kind that doesn't demand but radiates, was already standing across from him. Prince William grew up in the eye of a storm that never passed. Cameras before consciousness, headlines before heartbreak. As a boy, he watched the country mourn his mother not just as a princess, but as a symbol of compassion in a cynical world. He learned early that love for the monarchy wasn't guaranteed. It had to be lived, not inherited. His adolescence was shadowed by the weight of two worlds, the modern Britain that demanded transparency, and the ancient institution that demanded silence. Every smile, every handshake, every word was a performance with stakes higher than he ever asked for. Yet beneath the formality, William held on to something rare: authenticity. While others turned to privilege, he turned to people. He walked through hospital corridors where grief hung heavy in the air, held the hands of veterans who couldn't salute anymore, sat with children who didn't care about titles, just kindness. These moments didn't make headlines, but they made character. He watched his father, King Charles, carry decades of criticism with a kind of tired grace. No public outbursts, no retaliation, just persistence. It taught him that restraint wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. He understood that the true measure of royalty wasn't in grandeur, but in endurance. Yet there was always tension beneath the calm. A world eager to call him irrelevant. A public obsessed with the flaws of the institution he represented. William's journey became about redefining relevance without losing reverence. He wasn't just his father's son. He was his mother's spirit wearing a crown of restraint. When the whispers about the monarchy's future grew louder, he didn't respond with speeches or slogans. He responded with service. Real, quiet, human service. And so when Starmer's words cut across that sacred hall, it wasn't pride that rose in William. It was protection. Protection for something beyond heritage. The belief that leadership could still mean humility. That dignity could still disarm cynicism. He didn't need to prepare comebacks or craft rhetoric. His composure had been forged through grief, through headlines that called him stoic when he was simply surviving. Every tragedy, every public smile, had become armor not of ego, but of empathy. That day, as the words, "The crown must answer for its privilege," hung in the air, William didn't hear an attack on power. He heard an attack on purpose, and in that moment everything his life had taught him, about loss, restraint, duty, and quiet strength, rose to the surface. He wasn't defending a throne. He was defending the idea that service still matters, that silence can be stronger than spectacle. Transition. And when he finally decided to speak, the room would learn that calm can thunder louder than any voice. The tension was a living thing now, rippling through every breath in the room. Starmer straightened, sensing his advantage, his voice steady, practiced. "Public service," he said, "must always answer to the public, even the crown." A few heads nodded. Cameras tilted closer. William didn't move. His stillness was unnerving, regal in its restraint. The silence stretched, long enough to make even the boldest feel exposed. He could have ignored it, smiled, stepped back into diplomacy. But something shifted in his eyes, a glint of the same quiet defiance that once lived in his mother's. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, deliberate. "And yet," he said, "some services aren't performed for applause, but for sacrifice." The words landed like the softest punch, unexpected, clean, impossible to counter. The audience stirred, caught between reverence and revelation. Starmer opened his mouth to reply, but found no rhythm left to stand on. Transition. What followed wasn't debate. It was demolition by composure. William's words hung in the air like smoke from a just-fired cannon. Quiet, drifting, but impossible to ignore. The crowd shifted, unsure whether to breathe or listen harder. Starmer forced a polite smile, ready to regain control. But William wasn't done. He took a step forward, not in aggression, but in quiet conviction. "My father," he said evenly, "has spent his entire life serving this country, not for votes, not for applause, but because he believes service is its own reward." The tone wasn't defensive. It was personal, stripped of pretense. Starmer's smirk faltered. Cameras zoomed in. The weight of sincerity began to eclipse the theater of politics. William continued, "You speak of accountability, but some responsibilities don't begin with ambition. They begin with duty. That's what you sometimes forget, Sir Keir. Service without self-interest deserves respect." A ripple passed through the audience. Veterans straightened. Journalists lowered their pens. Even the chandeliers seemed to dim, as though listening. Starmer tried to interject, but William's calm was relentless. "You fight for terms. He's fought for time. For the kind of world you'll retire in. I think that deserves more than suspicion." The air cracked, not with applause, but with silence heavy enough to be felt. Every phone, every lens, every eye was on William. It wasn't rage that commanded the room, it was reason. He paused, letting the words breathe. Then the final line, deliberate and devastating. "Criticism has its place, but building something that lasts, that's rarer. And my father has done that quietly, longer than most have listened." It wasn't a retort. It was revelation. Starmer's face tightened, searching for footing, but his practiced eloquence suddenly felt mechanical. The contrast was unbearable. One man driven by need to prove himself, the other anchored in peace with who he was. The crowd didn't cheer. They simply stared, transfixed, aware they had witnessed something that transcended argument. A faint murmur rose. One veteran whispered, "That's leadership." Another guest nodded slowly, eyes glistening. William offered a polite nod, extended his hand toward Starmer. The gesture, simple and unspoken, was the final blow. Starmer shook it, but his face told the truth. He hadn't just lost the exchange. He had been dismantled, not by rhetoric, but by restraint. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of realization, of reckoning, of quiet respect. And as William turned away, the cameras captured the moment that would echo across the nation. The heir who didn't need a crown to remind Britain what dignity looked like. Transition. But beyond those walls, the silence didn't stay silent for long. By the next morning, the internet was on fire. The clip, 1 minute, 32 seconds, was everywhere. Prince William destroys Starmer without raising his voice. It wasn't just a headline. It was a phenomenon. Hashtags exploded. Royal respect. William wins. Grace is power. Twitter was a battlefield of admiration and disbelief. "That's how you handle arrogance," one user posted. He didn't argue. He educated. TikTok edits turned William's calm expression into an anthem. The silence after his words became the beat drop in 1,000 remix videos. Commentators on morning shows replayed the pause frame by frame. "That 5 seconds," one journalist said, "did more for the monarchy's public image than any speech in a decade." Meanwhile, political circles scrambled. Some praised Starmer for raising hard questions, but even his allies admitted he'd been outclassed, not defeated through politics, but through presence. The story took on a life of its own. Pundits debated what it symbolized. Was it the rebirth of royal relevance? The triumph of composure over confrontation? The people didn't care for analysis. They cared for what it felt like, and what it felt like was justice. Not royal, not political, but human. Memes called it the calm clapback. International outlets called it Britain's 1-minute lesson in leadership. But beneath the viral humor was something more, a collective sigh of relief. For a fleeting moment, Britain saw something rare, a public figure choosing grace instead of grandstanding. Transition. And as the noise swelled online, one question lingered quietly beneath it all. What did this moment really mean? It wasn't about monarchy or party lines anymore. It was about poise, the kind that reminds people who they want to be when the world feels divided. William's silence had become a mirror. People saw in it what they longed for, integrity that didn't scream to be noticed. In a culture addicted to outrage, he'd offered restraint, and it resonated. Not because it silenced an opponent, but because it awakened something deeper, the craving for dignity in leadership. Later reports claimed King Charles quietly thanked his son. "You reminded them," he said softly, "why silence still carries weight." But the true victory wasn't in headlines or hashtags. It was in hearts recalibrated by grace. Because what William proved that day wasn't that he could win a debate. It was that character still counts, even when it's unfashionable. Transition. And for those who watched it unfold, the echo of that lesson would not fade easily. 1 minute. That's all it took. A calm voice, a poised defense, a reminder of what leadership could look like. In a world where shouting matches dominate every screen, Prince William's quiet defiance became a masterclass in control. He didn't just defend his father, he defended the idea that service is sacred. That respect doesn't need power to stand tall. As viewers, we felt something stir, something we've missed. The belief that decency can still disarm cynicism. So if this moment moved you, share it. Let it ripple. Let it remind others that grace still matters. Because in a time of noise, calm is rebellion. And maybe that's the real legacy of this story. Not royalty, not rhetoric, but restraint. The camera fades on two figures, father and son, side by side, symbols not of dominance, but of endurance. Because sometimes the loudest statement is silence.